The contract has expired, Miss Celine. We are now equal business partners. Ethan's voice was flat, as if stating a commercial fact. Celine stood there, images surging through her mind. His hands signing in the study. So steady. The look he gave Julian in the cafe. Calm. The silhouette of him as he left the Shun residence. He didn't look back. He never argued, never fought back, never complained. Because he simply didn't care. He was only keeping his promise. And now he stood in this office, holding the commercial lifeline of Bin Hai City in his hands, holding the life and death of the Shun Group. The person she had scorned for a year. The one who decided the fate of the Shun family. Chapter 1. Leaving with nothing. The curtains in the Shun family study were drawn tight. The 10 o'clock morning light leaked in only through a seam, falling on the rosewood desk like a thin blade. Celine sat behind the desk, a document spread before her. She didn't look at Ethan. Her fingertips tapped the paper. Sign it. Ethan stood in front of the desk, 2 paces away. He glanced down. An agreement to dissolve the marriage. Terms clear and phrased coldly. He would leave with nothing, not taking a single cent from the Shun family. The agreement is very clear. Celine's tone was like reading a quarterly report. After 1 year, the marriage is automatically dissolved. You leave empty-handed, and the Shun family will not pursue the expenses for your living and board during that year. Claire stood by the window, arms folded, a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. She had deliberately changed into a new chi-pao today, as if preparing to attend some sort of celebration. We, the Shun family, have kept you for a year. We've already been as benevolent and righteous as we can be. Claire's voice was low, but each word was driven like a nail. Ethan didn't respond. He picked up the fountain pen on the table and wrote his name on the signature line. The strokes were proper, the pressure even. His hand did not tremble in the slightest. Celine stared at his signing hand, her brow knitting ever so slightly. Too fast, too steady. Someone about to lose everything shouldn't be this calm. She said, "You sign with such ease." An agreement is an agreement. Ethan put down his pen and stepped back. Claire snorted coldly. Is that it? You don't want to fight for anything for yourself. No need. Ethan turned and walked out of the study. Celine watched his back, feeling that something was off. His stride didn't look like that of someone being driven out. It seemed more like someone who had finally been waiting for this. The guest room door closed. Ethan stood in the center of the room and looked around. A year. He opened the wardrobe. 3 outfits hung inside, the same as when he had brought them a year ago. He took them down one by one and folded them into the old suitcase, his movements unhurried. In the drawer, there was a scrap of paper. 6 months ago, Celine had a fever of 39.5. He had gone out in the middle of the night to buy the fever medicine. The pharmacy's handwriting was crooked. He had recopied it, set the medicine and water on her bedside, and then returned to this guest room. She woke the next day and asked the maid who had bought the medicine. The maid said she didn't know. Celine didn't ask again. Ethan looked at the prescription for a few seconds, put it back in the drawer, and closed it. The suitcase clicked shut with a soft sound. 1 year. The debt my father owed the Shun family. I paid it off. At the Shun family's main gate, Ethan dragged his suitcase out. Claire's voice came from behind. Don't look back. Keep walking. He didn't look back. A black sedan was parked by the roadside, its windows tinted dark. Ethan tossed his suitcase into the trunk, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. His phone vibrated. Caller ID, Ryan. He answered. The voice had changed. It wasn't the languid, silent Ethan from the study, but steady low, carrying a composed pressure. Speak. On the other end of the line, Ryan's voice carried a year's worth of suppressed urgency. Boss, the Jaha project is in position. Huadong Securities has also, as you wanted, slowed down the Shun Group's listing approval. The cash flow. The Shun Group won't hold out past 3 months. If their Hong Kong listing application gets rejected, their funding will collapse immediately. Ethan drove onto the main road. In the rearview mirror, the Shun family's gate receded further and further. He said, "No rush. Wait for her to come to me." Ryan was silent for 2 seconds. "Are you sure?" Sure. Ethan's tone was flat, as if speaking of something inconsequential. The contract's up, Celine. We're equals now. He hung up the phone and pressed the accelerator. 2 p.m., the Shun family living room. Celine curled up on the sofa, holding a cup of tea she hadn't drunk even though it had gone cold. Julian sat beside her, his long fingers twisting the gold-rimmed glasses, a gentle smile at the corner of his mouth. Julian asked, he left? He left. Left with nothing, cleared out, didn't take a thing. At least he's sensible. Celine didn't reply. She stared at the tea leaves floating and sinking in the cup, her brow never relaxing. Julian noticed. What's the matter? When he signed that contract, his hand was too steady. What do you mean? Celine set down her teacup and turned to Julian. A man about to be left with nothing shouldn't be so calm. His hand didn't tremble when he signed. His steps were steady when he walked out of the study. When he left the Shun household, she paused. The way he looked at me wasn't one of loss. It was relief. Julian's smile froze for a moment, then returned to its usual ease. Maybe he's just a good-for-nothing, used to being driven away. Celine shook her head. No, a worthless man who's been cast out would be furious, resentful, at least argue a bit. He said nothing. It was like what? Like finally being free. The living room fell silent for a few seconds. Julian put his glasses down, his tone growing more serious. Check on him. I don't feel at ease. Celine looked at him. You think something's wrong with him? A person without a past shouldn't be this calm. Julian stood up and straightened his suit. I'll have someone probe into his background. Celine didn't object. She lifted the cup of cool tea again and took a sip. Bitter. She remembered the steady hands when Ethan signed, remembered the back that didn't look back when he left, remembered that in this year he had never argued even once. Ethan, who are you really? Chapter 2. Investigation and Suppression. 3 days later, the Shin Corporation conference room. The report submitted by the legal team lay on the table. Only a few thin pages, glaringly white. Julian flipped through it twice, his brow knotted into a frown. Celine sat opposite him, watching the motion of his fingers, turning the pages. Well, too clean. What do you mean? Julian pushed the report over and tapped a line with his fingertip. Ethan's identity information is unnaturally clean. No bank statements, no social security records, no social traces, no employment history. Not even a traffic ticket. Julian leaned back in his chair, the gaze behind his gold-rimmed glasses sharpened. Garbage shouldn't be this clean. Garbage should have gambling records, debt records, all sorts of messy stuff. But he has nothing. Celine said nothing. She stared at the last line of the report. No abnormal correlations found. And closed the file. She asked, did he deliberately hide it? Julian glanced at her. Or his identity is fake. Evening, a cafe in the west of the city. Julian arrived before Ethan and chose the window seat. 2 Americanos sat in front of him. When Ethan pushed the door open, he sized him up from head to toe. Old jacket, faded jeans, no different from when he walked into the Shun household a year ago. Sit. Julian nudged one of the coffees. Ethan sat down and didn't touch the cup. I heard you moved out of the Shun place. Julian's tone was casual, as if making small talk. Where are you living now? A friend's house. Julian chuckled. A friend? You, a waste like you have friends? Ethan didn't respond. He looked out the window. Across the street, an old man was walking his dog, moving very slowly. Julian's impatience grew with his silence. Celine asked me to ask you, what on earth have you been doing at the Shun household this past year? Take care of Celine. Julian lifted his coffee. You useless piece of trash. What can you possibly do to take care of Celine? Ethan turned his head back and glanced at him. Just one glance. The hand holding the cup paused. Julian couldn't name what was in that look. Not anger, not humiliation, not even indifference. Just calm, as if he were observing something that had nothing to do with him. Julian set the cup down and lowered his voice by half a tone. I advise you to stay away from Celine. She's mine now. Fine. That's your response? Ethan stood up. The agreement has expired. Who Celine is with is none of my business. He stepped out of the cafe, his pace as steady as the day he left the Shun family. Julian stared at his retreating figure, tapping the cup's rim 3 times with his finger. That night, Ding Tai Capital Headquarters, 88th floor. Ethan sat in the CEO's chair, the financial statements of the Shun Group spread out on the desk before him. He flipped the pages quickly, his gaze skipping between figures, pausing now and then to circle a number with a red pen. Ryan stood by the desk, holding a tablet. Boss, Shun Group's cash flow has tightened to a critical point. Regarding their Hong Kong IPO application, Huatong Securities has been slowing the approval process as you instructed. When do you need the no-objection letter for the Jiaha project? By the end of next month. If Ding Tai Capital doesn't issue the letter by then, Shun Group's listing application will be rejected. Ethan closed the report, the red pen landing on the desk with a soft click. Then wait. Ryan hesitated for a moment. Boss, when are you going to make a move? Not in a hurry. Ethan stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. The night view of city spread out beneath them. The myriad lights looked like pieces on a chessboard. Let her worry first. You mean you want her to beg you? The contract has expired, Ryan. Ethan's voice was very even, as if stating a fact. We are now equal business partners. She needs me more than I need her right now. Ryan didn't say anything more. He turned and left. Ethan stood by the window, his gaze falling toward the southeast of the city, where the Shun Group's building stood, its top-floor lights still on. He stared for a few seconds, then drew the curtains. The Shun family's living room, late at night. Celine curled up on the sofa, the investigative report pinched in her hand, reading it over and over. Julian sat beside her and poured a glass of red wine, offering it to her. She didn't take it. The findings are too clean. Julian spoke first. I suspect he has someone backing him. Celine looked up. Someone backing him? What do you mean? Maybe he's not as simple as he seems. Maybe someone is helping him hide his identity. Celine frowned. Impossible. He's just a loser. I've seen him at his worst. But a loser shouldn't have no past. Julian put down his glass, his tone grown serious. A normal person wouldn't have even a single traffic ticket unaccounted for, unless someone wiped every trace away for him. Celine fell silent. She remembered Ethan's steady hands when he signed, the silhouette of him leaving without looking back, the way he looked at Julian in the cafe. Not with anger, not with shame. It was calm, like watching something that had nothing to do with oneself. I suggest we keep investigating. Find out who he really is. Celine's voice was a little weary. Is it necessary? He's gone already. Julian stood up and straightened his cuffs. I don't feel comfortable. What if he comes back looking for trouble? Celine didn't answer. She set the investigation report on the coffee table, lifted the glass of red wine, and took a sip, still bitter. The same bitterness as the glass of cold tea 3 days ago. Chapter 3. The Return of Ding Tai. 1 week later, Ding Tai Capital Headquarters, 88th floor. The meeting room door opened from the inside, and all the core members stood up at once. Ethan walked in, black suit, shoulders straight, a far cry from the man who had walked into the Shun household a year ago. He glanced at the faces along the long table and took a seat at the head. Sit. Everyone sat down. Ryan was on his right, opening his notebook. Max sat opposite, clutching a project progress sheet. This past year, thank you all for your hard work. Ethan's voice was low, but every person in the meeting room heard him clearly. Ryan spoke first. Boss, during the year you were away, Ding Tai Capital has been operating normally. The Jiaha project has been progressing as planned, and Huatong Securities has been very cooperative. Ethan nodded, took the progress report from Max, scanned 2 lines, and circled a figure with his pen. When will the Shun Group's IPO enter the hearing phase? Max straightened a little. Expected at the end of next month. If we don't issue a no-objection letter for the Jiaha project, their listing will be directly stalled. What about the cash flow? Ryan flipped a page of his notes. Very tight. Shun Group urgently needs to go public to raise funds to fill a 3.2 billion yuan gap. If the IPO fails, the cash flow will break, and they won't last 3 months. Ethan put the schedule back on the table and leaned into the chair. Then wait. Max and Ryan exchange a glance. Max ventured, "Boss, do you mean, have Miss Celine come negotiate?" Ethan did not answer directly. He stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows of the conference room. The skyline of city is spread out below, the Shun Corporation building to the southeast, its top-level glass curtain reflecting the afternoon light. "Have Miss Celine send for me." That afternoon, Ethan's office. When Ryan pushed the door open, Ethan was standing by the window, holding a cup of black coffee. The beans were the ones Ryan had bought a year ago. During the year Ethan had been away, no one had dared touch them. Huadong Securities is already, per your instructions, slowed down the approval for the Shun Group's IPO. Ryan handed over the tablet. What did Benjamin say? He doesn't know who the ultimate controller of Dingtai Capital is. Ethan took the tablet and scanned the data. He only knows to follow E's orders. He's very cooperative. Keep slowing it down. Ethan set the tablet on the windowsill. Make Celine nervous. Ryan hesitated for a moment. Are you sure you want to do this? Ethan turned his head and looked at him. Ryan had followed him for 8 years. Since Dingtai Capital was still a small office, he'd never seen him hesitate. But in that moment, Ryan read something in his eyes. Not hesitation, but an emotion that had been suppressed for a year, slowly surfacing. The agreement has expired, Ryan. Ethan's voice was even. I kept my promise. Now it's her turn to come and talk to me. Ryan was silent for a few seconds, then asked a different question. Boss, do you still have feelings for Miss Celine? Ethan lifted his coffee and took a sip. It was cold. He put the cup down. Feelings? A year of marriage, and she never once looked at me properly. All she ever had eyes for was Julian. Then why do you still help her? I don't help. Ethan walked back to his desk, pulled out a chair and sat down, opened a new file. I'm just waiting for her to come and beg me. Evening, Shun Corporation, Chairman's office. Celine sat behind the desk, a message from Huatong Securities spread out before her. The chief financial officer stood opposite, his expression grimmer than the figures in the email. Miss Celine, our cash flow has reached a critical point. His voice was low. If the IPO can't proceed as planned, we may not last 3 months. Celine didn't look up. What's wrong with the IPO? Didn't Huatong Securities say everything was normal? This afternoon, Huatong Securities suddenly notified us that the approval process needs to be extended. Celine's fingers froze on the mouse. Extended? Extended by how long? At least 2 months. Celine looked up. 2 months? We can't wait 2 months. The CFO took a half step back. Huatong Securities didn't give a specific reason, only said they need more time to review. Celine stared at the email on the screen. The wording was polite but cold. Due to internal procedural adjustments, the approval period is expected to be extended by 60 working days. Is someone pulling strings behind the scenes? The CFO shook his head. We can't trace it. We have no access to Huatong Securities' decision-makers. Celine shut off the email. The screen went dark, reflecting her own face. Tiredness, anxiety, and an indescribable unease. That night, the Shun family living room. Celine told Julian about Huadong Securities extending the approval. He listened, his brow furrowing for a moment, then quickly smoothing out. Julian held his wine glass. Extending the approval? Why? I don't know, but I suspect someone's manipulating things behind the scenes. Who? Celine was silent for a few seconds. She wanted to say a name, but that name sounded absurd once spoken aloud. I don't know. Julian's tone was easy, as if he were helping her rule out impossible options. Could it be a rival? That happens a lot in the business world. Maybe. Celine looked down at her fingers, her nails digging into her palm. But I keep feeling this has something to do with Ethan. Julian put down his wine glass and smiled. That gentle, reassuring kind of smile. Ethan? He's a loser. How could he possibly be manipulating Huadong Securities? I know how absurd that sounds. Celine's voice was a little dry. But his background is too clean, unnaturally clean. Julian lifted his glass again. You're overthinking it. He's just a loser. Celine didn't speak anymore. She sank into the sofa and closed her eyes. What surfaced in her mind wasn't Julian's smiling face, but Ethan's back as he left the Shun residence. Steady steps, no glance back, as if heading to an appointment he'd been waiting a long time for. Ethan, what exactly are you waiting for? Chapter 4. Probing Confrontation. The crystal chandeliers of the five-star hotel in City A lit everyone's faces to a shine. Celine linked arms with Julian as they entered, wearing a black evening gown, her hair swept up, earrings scattering pinpricks of light. Julian wore a charcoal suit, his gold-rimmed glasses polished to a gleam, a glass of champagne in his other hand, his smile perfectly measured. Amid the clinking of glasses, Celine exchanged pleasantries with one face after another. The business circle in City A was small. The same familiar faces circulated. Julian stayed at her side the whole time, offering drinks, picking up conversations, smiling at the right moments, attentive to the point of faultless care. Until she saw Max. The investment director of Dingtai Capital stood at the edge of the crowd, talking with two real estate developers. Celine walked over. Max saw her and gave a slight nod. Mr. Max, long time no see. Max's gaze shifted from her face to Julian, paused for half a second. Miss Celine. And this is... Julian, my friend. Julian reached out his hand. Max gave it a shake, the pressure just right. But Celine noticed Max's expression. When he looked at Julian, his brow twitched for a moment before smoothing out. Miss Celine, how is the Shun Group's IPO progressing lately? Max turned his gaze back. Everything's normal. That's good. Max lifted his glass, as if about to say something, then swallowed it back. By the way, how has Mr. Ethan been lately? Celine's fingers tightened. Ethan? He's already left the Shun family. Max's expression changed. Not surprise, but something more complicated. He glanced at Celine, then at Julian, his lips moving, and in the end he said nothing. Celine added, the agreement has expired. We've dissolved the marriage. Max set his glass down and smiled faintly. Is that so? He was soon called away by others, leaving Celine standing there, the thorn in her heart driven another inch deeper. In a corner of the banquet hall, Celine pulled Julian aside. Did you notice Max's expression? Julian was adjusting his cufflinks. At the question, he looked up. What expression? When he heard Ethan's name, his face went strange. Also, he said Mr. Ethan, not just Ethan. The investment director at Dingtai Capital calling a loser Mr. Julian's hand paused. Maybe he just knows Ethan. Ethan's a nobody. How could he possibly know the head of investments at Dingtai Capital? Julian didn't respond. He resumed, straightening his cufflinks, his movements half a beat slower than before. You're overthinking it. Celine stared at him. Julian was acting out of character today. Usually he'd play along with her topics, but whenever Ethan was mentioned, he kept dodging. I don't think Ethan is ordinary. He's just a loser. Julian's voice hardened for half a beat, then softened again. Don't let him fool you. He's here to talk business tonight, not to pity losers. Celine said nothing more, but the barb had already sunk into her flesh. When the banquet ended, Celine used a headache as an excuse to leave early. She stepped out the hotel's side door, intending to go around to the parking lot. Her steps halted as she passed the back alley. Two people stood in the shadows. One wore a dark gray suit. It was Julian. The other was shorter, wearing a black coat, his back to her. Julian's voice drifted out from the darkness, kept very low, but the alley was so quiet that every word came through clearly. If Shun Corporation's IPO fails, its capital chain will snap. When that happens, the Shun family will be thrown into chaos. Another person laughed. Celine recognized the laugh. Hoarse, threaded with a greed that had been repressed for years. Zach, her great-uncle. Chaos is good. Zach's voice. When things fall apart, that's when I get my chance. Celine's back pressed against the wall. The cold bricks bit through her gown into her skin. Julian said, Celine has been investigating Ethan lately. I'm worried she'll find something. Ethan? A loser, what is there to find? His background is too spotless. I suspect someone is behind him. Zach's voice dropped. Whoever is behind him doesn't matter. As long as the Shun Corporation fails to go public, Celine will lose the board support. When that happens, the Shun family will be mine. Julian asked, and then? Then you marry Celine, inject the Shun Group's assets into the Liu family. We'll split the profits 50-50. Celine's hand was trembling. She clutched the strap of her handbag so hard her nails dug into her palm. The pain kept her from making a sound. She turned and walked back to the parking lot step by step. Each step trampled down on her own heartbeat. In the car, Celine sat in the driver's seat, both hands gripping the wheel until her knuckles went white. Julian had gotten close to her for the assets of the Shun Corporation. Zach, her second uncle, actually wanted to seize control of the Shun Company. An even 50-50 split. She closed her eyes as various images surged through her mind. The red wine Julian handed her, Zach's compliant smile at the board meeting, Claire's haughty tone when she said, "Our Shun family." Then another image rose up. Ethan's back as he left the Shun residence. His step steady, he didn't look back. The glance he gave Julian in the cafe. Not anger, not humiliation, calm. The hand he used to sign papers in his study. So steady. His silence throughout the year. Never arguing, never retaliating, never complaining. That wasn't the look of a worthless man. It was the look of someone who was waiting. Celine opened her eyes and stared at the night outside the windshield. Chapter 5. Memories in Pursuit. The Shun Family Study, morning. Celine sat behind the desk, the past year's photos and notes spread out before her. Sunlight slipped through the gap in the curtains and fell across the pictures, bleaching them. She flipped through them one by one. A family dinner photo, a dozen or so people sitting around a round table, Claire in the head seat, Zach at her side with a deferential smile. Celine sat next to Claire, Julian standing behind her with his hand on the chair back. Ethan wasn't in any of the pictures. She searched through every album and found him only in the corner of one family portrait, standing at the very edge of the frame, half his body obscured by the door frame, his expression blurred. When the servant took the picture, no one had even called him over. Celine pulled that photograph out and stared at it for a long time. She went over the expense records again. Every expense for the Shun family had an itemized detail. Claire's cheapao, her own handbag, Julian's alcohol, but Ethan's name never appeared even once. He had no transaction records at all, not even a single coffee charged to a card. She remembered getting a fever of 39.5 months ago. Waking in the middle of the night, there was a cup of warm water and a prescription on the bedside table. She asked the maid who bought the medicine. The maid said she didn't know. Now she recalled the handwriting on that prescription. Neat, strong, identical to the signature Ethan on the termination agreement. A useless person can't write that kind of script. Celine closed the photo album and picked up her phone. Afternoon, Shun Corporation. The legal team sat opposite Celine, their expressions grave. I want you to reinvestigate Ethan's identity. Celine's voice was half a tone lower than usual. This time dig deeper. Check whether any of his identity documents have signs of forgery. The legal director hesitated. Miss Celine, we've already checked all the channels. Celine cut him off. Check for forgery. ID card, household registration booklet, academic certificates. Check every one of them. After the legal team left, Celine sat alone in her office, staring at the skyline outside the window. To the southeast, the Shun Group's building glittered in the sunlight. A little farther on, the glass curtain wall of the 88th floor of the financial center reflected the same light. 2 hours later, the general counsel returned, his expression even worse than when he left. Miss Celine, we found something. Celine's fingers tightened on the tabletop. Ethan's identity information shows signs of forgery. The ID number belongs to someone who was deregistered 3 years ago. There's no original record for the household books issuing authority, and the school on his diploma has no record of ever admitting that name. Forged. Celine's voice was very soft. The legal director opened his notebook. Yes, and following the thread, we found some odd things. His identity information is indirectly linked to a company called Dingtai Capital. Celine's breath stopped for a second. Dingtai Capital? Yes. The technical method used to forge his identity information bears a high degree of similarity to the way a certain company under Dingtai Capital handles its documents. Celine said nothing. She stood up, walked to the window, and stared at the building housing the financial center's 88th floor in the distance. The next morning, Huatong Securities. Benjamin's office was on the 28th floor, with a view of half of City A outside the window. When Celine pushed the door open, he was leafing through documents. Seeing her, he stood up at once. "Miss Celine, why did you come in person? I want to ask, why was the approval for Shin Corporation's listing suddenly extended?" Benjamin's smile froze for a moment. "That was an internal decision of ours." "An internal decision? Whose decision?" Benjamin adjusted his glasses and avoided her gaze. "Dingtai Capital asked us to slow down the approval." "Dingtai Capital? What?" "Dingtai Capital is our largest investor. There, he wants us to wait a bit." Celine's fingers tightened on the strap of her bag. "E? Who is E?" Benjamin lowered his voice. "The actual controller of Dingtai Capital. The outside world only knows his code name. No one has ever seen him. All instructions are communicated by email and phone, and his signature is the code name." "Have you seen his signature?" Benjamin hesitated for a moment. "Yes, on Dingtai Capital's documents." "Can you show me?" Benjamin glanced at her, as if weighing something. In the end, he walked to the filing cabinet, pulled out an authorization letter from Dingtai Capital, and handed it to Celine. In the lower right corner of the document, a signature. The handwriting was neat, the pressure even, the stroke ending cleanly. Celine's hand began to tremble. Celine sat in the driver's seat, one hand holding the documents from Dingtai Capital, the other pulling from her bag a piece of paper folded into quarters. It was the prescription from half a year ago. She had taken it from the drawer in the Shun family study. She unfolded the prescription and placed it beside the letter of authorization. 2 signatures. Identical. The stroke's beginnings, developments, turns, and endings, the varying pressure and tempo, even the slight upward angle of the final horizontal stroke of the E, all exactly the same. Celine's hand was trembling. The paper quivered with it. Sunlight fell across it, and the 2 signatures seemed to corroborate one another. Impossible. Ethan, a loser. How could he? Dingtai Capital. Tens of billions in capital. Codename E. Never shown his face. And the man she had despised for a year. Meek and submissive, never arguing. Every day before her he was docile and compliant. The signature on the document was exactly the same as that of the person who controls Benhai City's commercial lifeline. Celine placed the prescription and the letter of authorization on the passenger seat, both hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She stared at the 88th floor of the glass-fronted financial center. "Ethan, who on earth are you?" Chapter 6. The Truth Revealed. Evening, the financial center. Celine's car was parked beneath the Dingtai Capital building, its nose pointed at the main doors like a beast that would shatter if it charged. She sat in the driver's seat and looked up at the lights on the 88th floor. An entire wall of floor-to-ceiling windows aglow, hanging in the dusk like a suspended amber. She grabbed the letter of authorization and the prescription from the passenger seat, slipped them into her bag, pushed the door open, and got out. When the receptionist saw her, their expression froze for a moment. "Miss Celine, do you have an appointment?" "I want to see E. The actual controller of Dingtai Capital. I want to see him." The receptionist's smile lasted half a second. Then she picked up the internal phone. Celine stood there, fingers clutching the strap of her bag, knuckles white. She heard the receptionist whisper a few words, then put down the phone. "Miss Celine, please come with me." The elevator rode from the first floor to the 88th in 47 seconds. Celine watched the floor numbers jump. Each second felt like someone driving a pin into her temples. The elevator doors opened, and at the end of the corridor was a black door. The receptionist stopped before it and stepped aside. "Miss Celine is inside." Celine drew a deep breath and pushed the door open. The office was huge, so big it felt unreal. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched from the ground to the ceiling. The nightscape of city a spread beyond them. The lights of countless homes and the lamps of ships in the harbor interwoven like a vast net. The desk was black walnut, its surface immaculate, holding only a computer and a stack of files. Someone sat behind the desk. The moment Celine made out that face, her feet rooted to the floor. It was Ethan, but not the Ethan she knew. No old jacket, no faded jeans, no deliberately slouched posture. He wore a black shirt, sleeves rolled to his forearms, shoulders straight, jawline sharp. Light struck him from the side, casting stern shadows across his face. He looked up and saw Celine, his expression unchanged. "Miss Celine, please have a seat." Celine stood in the doorway, unable to take a single step. Ethan stood up, walked around the desk, and went to the floor-to-ceiling window. With his back to Celine and his hands in his pockets, he looked out at the night view. Celine's lips twitched, the words squeezed out of her throat, dry as sandpaper. "You are Ethan Gu." He turned around. "The actual controller of Dingtai Capital. You can call me E." Celine's knees went weak. She braced herself on the doorframe to keep from falling. Her voice trembled. "Impossible. How could you be?" Ethan looked at her, his gaze calm, like he was reading an ordinary business document. "The agreement has expired, Miss Celine. We are now equal business partners." The words were like a knife, driven straight into Celine's chest. "You, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you explain?" "The agreement required me to conceal my identity." "Agreement?" Celine took a step forward. "Why didn't you? Why didn't you say when I told you to leave? Why didn't you say when we signed? Why? Do you need me to explain?" Ethan's voice was low, but Celine's words stuck in his throat. "You haven't looked me in the eye once this whole year." The office fell silent. Outside, the city kept moving, traffic, lights, voices, all cut off by the glass. Inside, only the breathing of the two people remained. Celine stood there, images churning through her mind, his hand signing in the study. So steady. The look he gave Julian in the cafe. Calm. The back of him as he left the Shun household. He didn't look back. He never argued, never struck back, never complained. Because he simply didn't care. He was only keeping his promise. She remembered the fever 6 months ago, the glass of warm water by the bedside, the prescription. He went out in the middle of the night to buy it, then returned to the guest room without saying a word. She remembered Claire's biting sarcasm. He bore it in silence. She remembered declaring before everyone that she would leave with nothing. He calmly signed. She remembered Julian humiliating him to his face, calling him a loser. He replied with a single word, "Fine." And now, he stood in this office, controlling the commercial lifeline of City A, holding the life and death of the Shun Group in his hands, in command of everything belonging to the man she had never once properly looked at. "Miss Celine." Ethan's voice pulled her back. He walked behind the desk, sat down, and opened a file. "Do you want to discuss the no-objection letter for Shun Corporation's IPO?" Celine stared at him. His handling of the documents was practiced. A red pen circled a figure, exactly the same kind of annotation she'd seen on the legal report. She had scorned him for a year. He was the one who had decided the Shun's fate. Celine turned and walked out of the office. The corridor was long and brightly lit. Her high heels clicked on the marble floor, each step sounding like treading on broken glass. The moment the elevator doors closed, she saw her face reflected in the metal, pale, disheveled, eyes rimmed in red. She didn't cry, but it hurt more than crying. Chapter 7. Collapse and the Pursuit of a Husband. 3 days later, the Shun Corporation boardroom. Celine sat in the seat of honor, a voice recorder placed in front of her. She pressed play, and the conversation between Julian and Zach drifted out of the speaker, every word crisp and clear. If Shun Corporation's IPO fails, the cash flow will collapse. Chaos is good. If everything falls into chaos, then I'll have a chance. You marry Celine, inject Shun Group's assets into the Liu family, and we split it 50-50. The meeting room was so quiet you could hear breaths. The board members looked at one another. Some began whispering. Zach's face shifted from red to white, then to ashen. "This is slander." Zach stood up, His chair skidded back a meter. She's forging recordings. Celine threw a file onto the table. The forensic audio report is here. Voice print comparison, a 100% match. Zach's lips moved, but no sound came out. He looked over at Julian. Julian didn't meet his eyes, his gaze fixed on the tabletop, the gold-rimmed glasses catching the meeting room lights. Celine's voice was flat. Uncle Zach, you are dismissed. As of today, you are no longer the vice president of the Shun Group. Zach froze in place, his hand gripping the edge of the table, his nails scraping the wood grain. Celine turned her head. Julian, we're done. Julian finally looked up. He wanted to say something, but Celine had already stood and walked out of the conference room. Behind her came Zach's roar and the sound of the security guard's footsteps, but she did not look back. She had more important things to do. Evening, Ding Tai Capital. Celine stood before the black door on the 88th floor, took a deep breath, and pushed it open. Ethan sat behind the desk, leafing through documents. He looked up, saw her, his expression unchanged. Ethan, Miss Celine, is there something I can do for you? Celine took 2 steps forward. I know I was wrong. Her voice shook. I shouldn't have looked down on you. Shouldn't have trusted Julian. Shouldn't have. Ethan set the documents down, his hands folded on the desk. Miss Celine, those are all things of the past. But the agreement has expired. His voice was even, like he was stating a business fact. We are now equal business partners. Celine stood there, the divorce papers in her bag scorching like a branding iron. She had wanted to take them out, tear them to pieces, and then say. Ethan pulled a document from the folder and pushed it to the edge of the desk. The no objection letter for the Shun Corporation's IPO. I've already signed it. You can go. Celine stared at the document. The name signed in red pen was neat and forceful, identical to the handwriting on that prescription. He signed. After she had said those words, he still signed. Celine picked up the file and turned to leave the office. The corridor was long and brightly lit. Her high heels clicked against the floor, each step like walking on a blade. Late at night, beneath the Ding Tai Capital building, Celine stood on the steps outside the main entrance, not leaving. It began to rain. At first just a few drops, cool as they hit her face. Then the rain grew heavier, striking the puddles on the ground and spraying up a white mist. She wasn't holding an umbrella. She hadn't brought one. At 2 in the morning, the lights in the Ding Tai Capital building went out. The front doors opened, and Ethan walked out, holding a black umbrella. He saw Celine on the steps and paused for a second. Celine lifted her head. Rain ran down her cheeks, impossible to tell whether it was rain or something else. Ethan, I'm sorry. Ethan glanced at her. Just a glance. Then he turned and walked to the car parked by the curb. The headlights came on. The engine started. The black sedan drove into the curtain of rain, its taillights dragging 2 red streaks through the downpour. Celine stood where she was, her legs so weak she felt as if she would collapse to her knees. An umbrella was handed to her from behind. She turned her head and saw the receptionist from Ding Tai Capital standing in the doorway, holding a long-handled black umbrella. Mr. Ethan said. The receptionist's voice was half drowned by the rain. Miss Celine, don't get wet. Celine took the umbrella, stood in the rain, and watched the car's taillights vanish around the corner. She held the umbrella, motionless, standing through the whole night. In the car, Ethan sat in the back seat, looking at the rearview mirror through the window. Celine held that black umbrella, standing in the rain like a statue. The rain struck the canopy, and the splashes wetted the hem of her skirt. His fingers tightened on his knee. 1 year. She despised him in the Shun family for a year. Claire mocked him for a year. Julian humiliated him for a year. He bore it all in silence for a year. Then she stood in the rain and waited for him all night. Ethan closed his eyes. Father's last wish. He hoped you would live for yourself. He opened his eyes and looked out the window. The rain was still falling, and the coastal city's nightscape blurred in the curtain of rain. Drive. The car merged onto the main road. Celine in the rearview mirror grew smaller and smaller until she finally vanished into the rain. Chapter 8. The Twist Ending. 1 month later, a five-star hotel in City A. The ballroom's crystal chandeliers made everyone's faces shine. A champagne tower stood in the center, waiters weaving through the crowd with trays, the clink of glasses blending with laughter. The Shin Corporation had successfully gone public. Celine wore a black evening gown and stood in the center of the ballroom, receiving one congratulation after another. Her smile was perfectly measured, but her gaze drifted toward the entrance from time to time. The door opened. Ethan walked in. He wore a black suit, shoulders straight, bearing calm and composed. People around him parted. Someone whispered, "Ephraim Dingtai Capital is here." Others glanced at him sideways. He made his way through the crowd and stopped in front of Celine. "Miss Celine, congratulations on the successful listing." Celine's heart skipped a beat. "Thank you." Ethan's voice was flat. "No need to thank me. This is a business collaboration." He turned and started walking toward another group. Celine reached out her hand, then drew it back. She watched his retreating back, the same as when he left the Shun family a year ago. Steady steps, straight shoulders. But she didn't want to let him go again. After 3 rounds of drinks, Celine carried her glass to the center of the banquet hall. She looked toward where Ethan stood and took a deep breath. "Everyone, I have something to say." The banquet hall fell silent. Every pair of eyes turned to her. "This past year, I made a grave mistake." Celine's voice was low, but each word was crystal clear. "The person I shunned for a year is the one who decided the fate of the Shun family. I ignored all the details I shouldn't have ignored. I'm sorry." She looked at Ethan. "Ethan, I want to start over. Not a contract, not a business arrangement. I mean, sincerely." The banquet hall was so quiet you could hear the champagne bubbles pop. Ethan looked at her, his expression unchanged. Then he walked over and stood in front of her. "Miss Celine, the contract has expired." Ethan's voice was as even as ever, but the corner of his mouth twitched. "This time it's my choice." Celine was stunned for a second. Then she saw Ethan was smiling. Not that polite, formal smile. A real smile. There was light in his eyes, a curve at the corner of his mouth. He said, "Then you'll have to chase for a long time." Celine's voice trembled. "It's okay. I have a lifetime." Ethan reached out his hand. Celine took it, her fingers tightening as if afraid he would vanish. The next morning, a city cemetery. Ethan stood before a gravestone, holding a bouquet of white chrysanthemums. Celine stood behind him, quietly looking at the photograph on the stone, a middle-aged man whose brows and eyes bore some resemblance to Ethan. Ethan's voice was soft. "Dad, I repaid the Shin family's debt for you." He laid the white chrysanthemums at the foot of the gravestone. "But this time, it's for myself." He turned his head to look at Celine. "Father, this is Celine." Celine stepped forward and bowed slightly to the tombstone. "Hello." There was a trace of a smile in Ethan's voice. "She's coming after me again now. I have decided to give myself a chance." Celine took his hand. They stood side by side before the tombstone. Sunlight slipped through the clouds and fell on the white chrysanthemums, the petals glinting with a faint light. A year later, the old Shun family mansion. The wisteria in the garden had bloomed, purple clusters hanging down and swaying whenever the breeze passed. Ethan sat on a bench with a stack of papers on his knees and a pen in his hand. Celine came out of the house, carrying a cup of tea. "Reading documents again?" "Quarterly report for the Shun Corporation." Ethan took the tea, sipped. "It's all right." Celine sat down beside him and leaned on his shoulder. "I chased you for a year, and you finally said yes. I was just testing your sincerity. Are you satisfied now?" Ethan set the teacup down and turned to look at her. Sunlight fell across her face, bright and striking, completely different from the woman who had handed him the termination agreement in the study a year ago. Barely passed. Celine smiled and buried her head in the hollow of his shoulder. "This time, it won't be wrong again." Ethan's voice came from above. "It won't be wrong again." Wisteria tassels swayed in the breeze, their scent filling the air. Servants' footsteps sounded in the distance, someone speaking loudly, yet the garden remained very quiet. Celine closed her eyes and listened to Ethan's heartbeat. 1 year. She recoiled from him for a year, then pursued him for a year. Now she a lifetime.